June 9th, 1943, 6:17 northeast of Bizerte, Tunisia. Feldwebel Otto Riedel lifts his 109's nose to check the contrails. Two silver streaks drop in from the cold. Not heavy bombers, not single-engine fighters. Two booms with a pilot pod between them, an insect with a forked tail. Riedel blinks, once, twice. The pair split, one climbing, one flattening into a fast, impossibly flat turn. The heavy thing turns, he thinks. How? He's still thinking when the first bursts arrive nose on, a single lance of tracers that begin and end in the same place. He shoves the throttle forward. The tracers follow without deflection. Seconds later, he's looking at the Tunisian coast upside down. In the debrief, he writes one word under Type Observed. Gabelschwanz. By mid-1943, German controllers had one number in their logbooks that they didn't like: 1,000. With drop tanks, the American twin boom had the legs to wander out to the edges of Sicily and back, out over the convoy routes, out past the line where German math said fighters should turn for home. It wasn't just new, it changed the map. The fork-tailed fighter Lockheed's P-38 Lightning was a contradiction the Luftwaffe did not expect. Twin engines, but no heavy fighter clumsiness. Big frontal area, but small at the gun sight. All its guns in the nose, no wing spread, no guesswork for deflection. The first lesson took 10 seconds to teach. The second would take months to learn. And the third, why the shape mattered beyond surprise, would rewrite the schedule of a continent-wide air war. The men who flew against it gave it a name that stuck: Der Gabelschwanz, Teufel, Fork-tailed Devil. The devil part was theater, locker room exaggeration. The forked tail was not. It forced a question into every German cockpit the moment a lightning appeared at 12 o'clock. What else are we wrong about? The numbers told a different story than habit. A twin should be slower, they thought. A twin should be an easy mark, nose on, they thought. A twin should struggle to climb. But by June 1943, the Luftwaffe's dispatches recorded too many cases where the expected thing did not happen. If this was true locally, what followed system-wide was simple. Routes once safe for freighters became killing grounds. Ferry flights to Tunisia grew costlier by the day. The line between tactical and strategic air power blurred in the Mediterranean haze. The forked tail wasn't an artist's flourish. It was a solution to a string of problems posed in 1937 in Burbank and answered with a machine that looked like nothing else in the sky. It did not mean invincibility, nothing did. It did mean the old German trick assess on silhouette. Assume performance from category broke the moment the Lightning's white contrail crossed the Sunday. By July, Luftwaffe maintenance crews in Sicily were adding a new shorthand to chalkboards on dispersal tracks. P-38, avoid head-on. They learned fast. The Lightning learned faster. The match that summer was not a duel of champions, not pilot versus pilot in a vacuum. It was a test of a concept: what happens if you pour range, climb, and concentrated nose fire into one airframe and ask it to do both the long leg and the close fight? The answer arrived in the hard math of sorties, interceptions, and ships burned black in blue water. He lived in a factory before he lived in the sky. In January 1939, the XP-38 lifted off from Marchfield, California, climbing into cold air and a cold truth. Power at altitude wins or loses a war of distance. The designer's Hall Hibbard in shirt sleeves, a young Clarence Kelly Johnson with a slide rule and a chip on his shoulder cut the airframe around that truth. The engines sat far apart in booms to feed turbos and radiators. The pilot sat alone in a press of gauges in the center nacelle, and the guns sat in a straight line where trigonometry would not matter in a turn. Counter-rotating propellers cancelled torque. The twin fins kept control when one engine quit. It was beauty only if you liked clean answers. Lockheed's test pilot Tony Levere drove those answers into the thin air above the Mojave and found a problem hiding inside success. In a steep dive, the Lightning could outrun its own controls. A high Mach shiver that stiffened the elevator until the sky narrowed to a tunnel. Everything went solid, he remembered later. I had to think my way out. Dive. Recovery flaps would come. A fix born from a bad feeling in a good airplane, but not overnight. The air war would not wait. The P-38 went to war early, anyway, because what it could do outweighed what it might do to an unwary pilot in a vertical dive. By August 14th, 1942, two Lightnings intercepted a Focke-Wulf 200 Condor over grey North Atlantic water near Iceland. Not a duel. A demonstration. Nose-mounted guns that needed no lead. A speed margin that erased escape angles. A long-legged fighter that could meet a long-legged patrol. The first American victory in the European theater looked like a footnote at the time. A year later, it looked like an opening statement. With Operation Torch in November 1942, the Lightning stepped into a theater that suited its math. Wide distances and narrow margins. The airstrips were dusty. The spares were scarce. The demands were absolute. By December, P-38 seconds were hunting along the Tunisian coast at altitudes where the air was cold, clear, and cruel to engines. On many days, only their turbos kept the cylinders honest at 25,000 feet. The Luftwaffe's Bf 109 seconds and Flug 190 seconds could not be everywhere. The Lightning made the cost of not being there today higher than the cost of trying tomorrow. Every feature of the twin boom that puzzled a German pilot had a reason on a drafting table. The booms carried Allison V's 1,710 engines, whose power did not fade as the horizon curved. Each engine breathed thin air as if it were thick, thanks to the General Electric turbo supercharger tucked behind the wing. The center nacelle freed the nose for four 50-caliber Brownings and a 20mm cannon, all in line, all pointed where the pilot looked. At convergence distances, the P-38 had the luxury of not caring about convergence. Those were the small things. The big thing was fuel. A Lightning wearing two external tanks could stride across the map in a way that lightened the bomber crew's shoulders and tightened every German nerve along the Gulf of Tunis. A range on paper 700, 900, sometimes more than 1,000 miles depending on throttle and tanks, became a schedule problem for the Luftwaffe. Interceptors needed fuel to loiter. Fields needed supplies to keep them flying. A web of assumptions ran from the size of a drop tank to the number of trucks on a road in Sicily to the number of torches in a blackout on a dock in Naples. You felt the P-38 at the front end when a flight of Ju-52s failed to arrive, and at the back end when someone asked why, and someone else muttered, "Lightning," and pointed at a fuel chart. January 1943. A German transport formation crossed the Strait of Sicily covered by Bf 109 seconds with fuel clocks already running thin. The weather was false clear, the kind of horizon that lies. The Lightnings came in above and behind. One section kept the escorts busy in long climbing spirals. The other cut down into the formation nose-on, firing without thinking about wingline spread. It was a technique more than a tactic, a way of fighting born from the gun placement itself. Junkers 52s fell into the sea like coins into a well. For the crews on the water, the new shape meant simple things. Less ammunition wasted to guesswork, fewer passes needed to kill. What happened next made the pattern obvious. In April 1943, the Axis attempted to push a surge of transports into Tunisia. Allied fighters swarmed Spitfires, P-40s, and Lightnings shearing the sky on the day later called Palm Sunday. It wasn't a P-38 only show. War never lets one machine claim a whole day. But pilots in both hemispheres learned that month that the fork-tailed American could arrive earlier, leave later, and punch hard at either end. German pilots adapted. They tried it all. Vertical attacks from above, where the Lightning's compressibility history might spook its pilot. Low-altitude drag races, where a clean 109 could be mean. Head-on passes tuned to hit and break away when the nose guns of the P-38 were still settling. But the contrast grew sharper. In a horizontal fight at medium altitude, the Lightning could sustain a turn longer than any twin had a right to. In a climb, especially in the thinner air where twins should gasp, the Lightning's turbos cheated on nature. And when one engine took a hit, the fighter's wide tail kept control honest. Crippled, it could still be flown. The Luftwaffe had a phrase for the twin-engine fear, Einmod, one, motored. The P-38 eroded that fear on days when a smoking boom still brought its pilot home. By September 1943, Lightnings covered shipping interdiction, escorted B-25s into Sardinia, and reached into Italy's ribcage. In 1 month, A single group could chalk up dozens of destroyed aircraft in the air and on the ground, and a quiet, uncatalogued number of locomotives, barges, and trucks left smoking behind hedges and under olive groves. The Luftwaffe logs showed not just fighters lost in combat, but convoys arriving thin, columns delayed, maintenance kits rerouted to replace radiators peppered with 50 caliber holes. The Luftwaffe's shock at the twin boom shape hardened into respect, then calcified into procedure. Controllers began pairing 109s and 190s to split a lightning flight and force a vertical fight where compressibility might whisper in the back of an American pilot's mind. Some staff leaders reminded new men, "Do not hold a straight head. On course against a P-38. Break off sooner than you would against a Spitfire. Never assume a twin is slow." But the numbers were not fixed lines on a chalkboard. They were ranges, weather-bound, and maintenance-bound. On cold winter days, turbo wastegate systems in early models misbehaved. Intercoolers in the wing, leading edges on F and G models, lost efficiency when sand and heat multiplied. A gloved hand fumbled a mixture lever in a cockpit cooled by high-altitude thinness because the heater could not keep up. Aided by conditions and by human limits, the Luftwaffe found windows to strike back. Victories were traded. The shock blurred into attrition. The stage shifted. In late 1943, the Lightning went north in strength, into the pale sun of East Anglia. New units in the 8th Air Force received P-38 H's and J's and took on a job that mattered more than any fight between aces. Keep the bombers alive long enough to hit something that would shorten the war. Escort range was arithmetic and blood. The Lightning could reach farther than a P-47 then, and certainly farther than a Spitfire. With 2 tanks and careful hands, a 55th Fighter Group flight could shepherd B-17 seconds deep into Germany and back, shaping the raid's lifelines like bent arrows across the map. But the air above Germany in winter was not the air above Tunisia in June. The thermometer fell. The sky bit. Early cockpit heating left pilots' feet numb. Oil grew thick. Turbos grumbled. Crews wrapped the booms in careful maintenance routines that mattered as much as courage. The Luftwaffe, recovering from summer redeployments, brought up experienced units and tactics refined in the crucible of defense. Straight-down boom and zoom attacks on escorted bomber streams could split an escort momentarily, and the moment was all a veteran needed. The Lightning answered in kind. The J model introduced chin radiators to clean up airflow and cooling. Later blocks added dive, recovery flaps that turned fatal anecdotes into manageable procedures. Formation tactics changed. Instead of clinging to the bomber box like a frightened brother, P-38 flights swept ahead and above, cutting off interceptions before they formed. A new trick appeared. Use the nose gun's lack of convergence to take long, decisive shots at closing angles where a wing-mounted battery would still be calculating. The escort job remained thankless. Success meant no one noticed, but the math on bomber losses improved when the sweeps worked. Then came days when it did not. January 1944 saw the Lightning learn again what cold does to metal and men, and what a defender on home turf can do with the right timing. A Luftwaffe radio net catching an escort in a turn. A Staffel pushing faster in a dive than it should, trusting its pilot's hands to guide a recovery. A P-38 trailing a plume of glycol and holding 3 degrees of rudder to bring its pilot back to a field dusted with snow. These scenes are not contradictions. They are the war. The micro becomes macro late in the winter. A bomber crew notices that fighters are over them earlier and still around when they turn for home. A German flak battery hears American guns at treetop height hours after lunch. A rail yard in Metz counts holes in the roofs of boxcars and finds more holes. Every additional minute the Lightning could stay with the stream, and every extra mile it could range ahead, meant a little less freedom for a defender to choose his own fight. On individual days, names mattered. On February raids over central Germany, a young American one among hundreds bounced a flight of 109s, firing at long range, watching an engine blossoms smoke. On April afternoons over Italy, a veteran German rolled in behind a P-38 at low altitude and discovered too late that the twin wasn't trying to outclimb him, but to outlast him in a flat turn where nose guns could walk shells up a canopy. These were micro-scenes inside a larger script whose plot was written by factories, fuel lines, and the limits of men perched between frost-bitten glass and screaming metal. A map is the only honest caption for the Lightning's design. Two booms tied by a wing, a center nacelle pressed forward. Radiators and turbos tucked where they work best, not where they look cleanest. The forked tail a wide lever against yaw when one engine dies. The nose a straight channel for ammunition with a 20mm shell as the period on every sentence. It is not elegant in the way a Spitfire is elegant. It is not glamorous in the way a 190th is glamorous. It is exact. And that exactness explains much of the Luftwaffe's first reaction. In 1940 and 1941, twins meant something in German memory. Bf-110s were Zerstörer destroyers, heavy fighters, good for chewing bombers, bad for tangling with deft singles. When a German pilot in 1942 saw two engines, he brought that memory to the fight. The P-38 punished him for it, not once, but over and over until the habit broke. The shock was not simply newness, it was category error, a human thing. You think you know the shape of a problem until a shape appears that solves a different problem and still beats you at yours. The Lightning's gun layout also rewrote a craft's muscle memory. In a wing-mounted battery, you set a convergence range, say 300 yards, and imagine invisible lines of bullet streams crossing in front of your target. Too close or too far, and your guns wrote ellipses around the thing you wanted dead. In the Lightning, bullets went where you looked, far and near. That gave Americans a small tactical edge in head-on shots and in quick, off-axis passes where no one had a clean, steady sight picture. Tiny advantages add up. A dozen minor edge cases become a dozen dead machines, and dead machines become lost patrols, and lost patrols become routes abandoned. The Luftwaffe learned to see a Lightning coming and remember all of this in seconds. A young pilot learned to respect the nose. A veteran learned to fear the climb in thin air. Controllers stopped assigning certain altitudes with casual confidence. Mechanics found themselves mounting extra cans on flight lines to fuel longer scrambles. None of these were headlines. All of them were results. And the Lightning itself kept changing. Early intercoolers in leading edges gave way to chin radiators that shaved temperature spikes. Boost control improved. Dive flaps let a pilot escape Mach's tightening noose with a calculated pull. The machine caught up with the mission assigned to it, shrinking the gap between what it should do and what war made it do. The Luftwaffe too adapted more pairs in the air, smarter vectoring, late-day strikes when the escorts were low on gas. This was not a one-sided revelation. It was a dialogue in gunfire. Zoom out further, and the twin boom stops looking like a fighter and starts looking like a logistical policy. Range meant sorties where escorts and strike packages learned to live together, not meet briefly at the target and drift apart. A nose battery that didn't waste ammunition on geometry meant fewer resupply runs just to top off 50 caliber belts. Two engines meant maintenance that could accept the occasional bullet through a prop spinner without writing off the pilot. And, crucially, twin turbos meant high-altitude performance when the cold clawed at everything else. Each of these delivered a tiny dividend. Together they paid compound interest in campaign timelines. Back in Tunisia, in that first summer when everything felt new, a P-38 came home on one engine as dusk pushed the shadows long. The crew chief counted holes a dozen, maybe more, and the pilot talked through a landing made with one hand because the other hand had cramped from the tension of holding rudder against asymmetry. He laughed once, a dry thing, when he said he could still hear the bullets leaving the nose. The crew chief said nothing, just ran his hand along the seam where the nacelle met the boom. The next morning, the aircraft flew again. There is the war. Counts on a clipboard. Oil stains on concrete, a new pair of booms lining up with a rising Sunday. By early summer of 1944, Lightning groups in the Mediterranean were hitting rail yards at dawn and Luftwaffe dispersals by midday, then roaming roads by late afternoon. In the north, their cousins escorted heavies past the Rhine. Pilots had learned the airplane's bad habits and tamed them. The airplane had learned the war's bad neighborhoods and navigated them. The Luftwaffe had traded shock for doctrine, and doctrine for improvisation, and improvisation for the hard work of trying to make up fuel and pilots at a rate the Allies now denied. The truth hid in the arithmetic of surviving the day. A bomber crew in a B-17 climbed into the morning with a small, quiet hope that the fighter with two tails would be there, and would still be there, and would be close enough when the contrails turned into black smudges where 109s and 190s were waiting. A German flak crew watched contrails and tried to predict the sweep pattern of escorts, marking when lightnings arrived ahead of the bombers instead of beside them, a change that turned setups into broken plays. A ground controller in Lille stared at a plotting board where red markers appeared earlier than they should and stayed longer than they should. All of it, all the numbers and glances and gestures, spiraled back to that first thing the Luftwaffe felt when the twin boom carved across the sun. Surprise. Surprise that a twin could fight like a single. Surprise that a single could escort like a twin-engine patrol. Surprise that one machine could stretch a map. The surprise did not last, but the consequences did. What made the forked tail matter wasn't the shape. It was what the shape allowed. Two engines spread wide enough for clean airflow and stable handling on one mill, a central gun deck that ignored convergence, long fuel lines and hard points that turned a fighter into a range policy, a cockpit balanced so close to the center of gravity that even violent maneuvers felt predictable. The Luftwaffe learned each of these truths at a cost. So did the Americans. There were costs the shape could not erase: cold air that numbed fingers in January over Germany, a Mach line that punished shallow thought, a maintenance burden that asked for smart hands and costly parts. The lightning took its place neither as miracle nor as myth, but as a tool that expanded the reach of a strategy at a moment when reach mattered more than flair. And still, the image returns. A 109 pilot rolling out of cloud and seeing not one fuselage but three pieces tied by a wing, and thinking for an instant that his eyes are wrong. That fleeting doubt was the P-38's first victory every time, and sometimes its last. War thrives on those instants. War builds empires on them. By the time summer thickened over Italy and northern France in 1944, the Luftwaffe had filed the form: when encountering P-38 seconds, avoid prolonged head-on, avoid low-speed flat scissor unless sure of advantage. Beware. Climb past 20,000 feet. The form did not save enough pilots. It did save some. On both sides, the learning curve was paid in men. The open question remains, carried forward into every briefing and every debrief that mentions the twin boom with the flicker of some earlier awe. Why did a shape create a panic, then a method, then a memory? The answer distills when you set a lightning on a map and a schedule and a tactic. It wasn't that the Luftwaffe had never seen a twin-engine fighter. It was that they had never seen a twin that could do this and that, on this day and that day, and keep changing just enough that yesterday's tactic was a trap for tomorrow. The P-38's entry into the war was not a flip of a switch, but a ramp, a steady climb from a risky dive test in Mojave to a cold morning over Germany, where a pilot reached down to tap a heater that finally worked and felt his toes come back to life. It was iteration and persistence. It was the compression of details into a capability that forced an opponent to throw away a stencil and pick up a pencil. And that's where we leave it for now. In the thick of 1944, with two tails flicking through cloud, with men on the ground counting minutes and miles, with controllers adjusting plans on boards that look more like chess than dice. The mystery is not whether the lightning shocked its enemy. The mystery is what, exactly, that shock changed in the larger machine of war. By March 1944, the lightning had done something subtle and strange. It had begun to arrive before it arrived. German controllers in Reims and Oldenburg would vector a staffel to the northwest on reports of bombers tracked at 22,000 feet and find the escort already sweeping the sky beyond the point of interception. The forked tails were not glued to the bomber boxes anymore. They were a moving fence, a picket line thrown miles ahead, catching the attacker as he formed. The first time this happened to Lieutenant Karl Brendel, he filed the exact words that told the truth. They were early. He meant early on the clock, early on the geometry, early on the plan. That single word closes the loop we opened over Tunisia. The shape that shocked was really a clock that shifted. The moment of inversion came in a week of gray days when everyone's nerves were thin. A bomber stream crossed the Rhine. A staffel of 190s climbed to meet it at a prearranged point. The prearrangement died when 4 P-38 seconds appeared at right angles, cutting the intercept as it formed and forcing the defenders to dive away without firing a shot. This wasn't luck. It was math. Fuel enough to roam, speed enough to choose the angle, guns and a nose that punished half-formed plans. Not a duel, but architecture. The Luftwaffe still fought back and sometimes won, but the pattern was visible now to anyone who looked at a plotting board crowded with pins. The twin boom was not simply a fighter. It was a scheduling weapon. The Lightning's nose made the second inversion clear. German flight school muscle memory said, "If you must engage head-on, do it with nerve and speed. Wing batteries can shatter a complacent attacker at the merge." Against a Lightning, the calculus turned inside out. No convergence, no spread. Lines, not arcs. In practice, that meant something quiet and lethal. Shorter firing windows still killed. "I thought he would break off sooner," Oberfeldwebel Hans Keller admitted, after limping home with a canopy stitched by 50-caliber holes that walked to the engine. He expected a Spitfire's geometry. He got a straight answer from guns that did not care about distance in the same way. The rulebook was not wrong. It was obsolete here, now, at this altitude, against this nose. Then came the third inversion, and it was about fear. The old, twin-engine dread Einmott drove most pilots into a spiral of bad choices the first time a cylinder coughed. The Lightning resisted that spiral. A wounded P-38 remained a governed machine. With a wide tail and counter-rotating props, a pilot could command it, not merely plead with it, men noticed. "I dragged her home on one," an American said, tapping the nacelle with his glove. "She didn't snake on me once." The implication spread larger than anyone saved. Escorts stayed over the bombers 5 minutes longer because they dared to stay. Strafers pressed a second pass at a rail yard because the risk curve bent in their favor. 5 minutes is everything in a sky where 20 seconds can decide a day. By April, the Luftwaffe's file on the Lightning grew fat with workaday cautions: avoid sustained head-on, beware of climbing beyond 20,000, do not follow into a shallow dive after a steep one. But below the boldface warnings lay a confession no one wanted to write. The Americans had found a fighter that stitched rolls together without falling apart. Escort at dawn. Intercept transports by noon. Sweep roads at 4. The very thing Germans mocked in 1940, a twin pretending to be agile, had matured into a system that ate time, space, and choice. What happened next made the pattern final. Dive flaps on late J models turned compressibility from a killer into a procedure. Chin radiators on J and L models tamed heat spikes and cleaned up airflow. Boost controls grew steadier. With each small fix, the Lightning moved closer to the idea that birthed it, a high-altitude, high-endurance gun platform that could pick its fight and leave when it was done. The Luftwaffe could still ambush, still invent, still punish overconfidence. None of that ended, but the windows narrowed. A pilot, stepping into a 109 in spring 1944, stepped into a shrinking set of good choices. The thesis lands in a line. The P-38's twin-boom concept did not just change silhouettes. It changed schedules, and schedules decide wars. Consequences piled up where most histories don't linger. On tarmac, in maintenance shacks, at fuel dumps, in briefings that sounded more like factory meetings than heroic speeches. A staffel leader who once trusted a 10-minute loiter now planned for 3. A railway dispatcher, who counted on dusk to hide a column, found 50-caliber holes punched through tarps at 7:40. A controller who assumed he could stack his fighters one after another learned the escort would be there both early and late, unless weather made liars of everyone. Ground crews saw the change in the items they requisitioned most. Less emergency ammunition. More drop tanks. More spark plugs after sustained high-altitude runs. Fewer replacement pilots returning white-faced after a head-on that went wrong, because their commanders now forbade the old gambit against the forked tail. On the map, the shift was easiest to see. Arcs of fighter coverage that once grazed the edges of targets now overlapped and deepened. In Italy, Lightning slashed into the Po Valley, hit rail yards at Modena, and rolled out to hit bridges over the Oglio, then got home on fumes with one engine canted 2 degrees left. In France, they ranged ahead of bomber formations to rattle flak batteries and frighten scattered interceptors into wasteful climbs. In the Low Countries, they perfected a grimly efficient routine. Pop up over a road bend, shear a truck convoy at the head and tail, then move a field over and do the same to the relief column drawn by smoke. Each of these acts seems small. Together they slowed clocks, frayed timetables, and forced the Luftwaffe to burn fuel on scrambles that never reached a target. The war still punched back, cold bit throats over Munster. Flak stitched holes in radiators. Fog ate mornings whole. A lightning turned into a tumbling silhouette when its pilot forgot a new limitation and chased a 90 into a speed regime where reactions narrowed to a finger width. The Luftwaffe landed blows that mattered. Veterans learned to bait escorts into dives that brushed old compressibility zones. Units timed interceptions to the minute and escort swapped tanks. That tiny window when a hand reached for a selector and a mind split its attention. None of this changes the arc. It sharpens it. Systems only prove themselves against resistance. What happened inside cockpits always anchors the larger machine. June 10th, 1944, a day after the beaches erupted. Captain Henry Darrow flew a lightning at treetop height over Bocage, the twin booms casting staccato shadows over hedges. A German column tried to hide under orchard canopies. He split S, rolled to line the nose with a cart road, and fired in a short, tight burst that stitched the lead half-track and hung 2 seconds on the second. He told his wingman later, "I caught myself not overleading. I just looked, and it went there." The sentence is plain, the implication is not. In the chaos of low-altitude work dust, smoke, tree lines, guns that do not need geometry, lessen cognitive load. Less load, fewer misses. Fewer misses, fewer passes. Fewer passes, fewer men risking a second look at the same flak gun. Micro fused into macro in the reconnaissance variant, the 5. A lightning with cameras in the nose where the 20mm once Saturday. Photographs stitched together days before assaults showed bridges intact or down, marshalling yards full or empty, fighter fields busy or bare. The Luftwaffe felt that eye as keenly as it felt the teeth. Separate roles were supposed to require separate airframes. The twin boom bent that rule without breaking itself. A commander could plan with a fleet of machines that looked alike and did different jobs on the same airframe. Simpler training pipelines, simpler spares. A dozen small simplifications paid out in velocity. By late summer, journeys that once were proud dashes became chores for the German defense. Escort ranges combined with fighter sweeps that felt like weather always there, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, never absent. When an interception did form, it formed under watchful eyes. And when the Luftwaffe's veteran cadres thinned, replaced by young men with less than a dozen hours in type, the Lightning's predictability as a machine, its steady handling on one engine, its honest stall, its checklists that translated into muscle meant American pilots made fewer tragic mistakes. A system grows stronger not only by adding better features, but by subtracting worst failures. On the ground, quartermasters saw proof they could post to a wall. Where P-38s operated, the appetite for 50-caliber ammunition rose in line with sortie tempo, while the wastage curve flattened. The Lightning used what it carried with a precision that saved trucks. Drop tank usage patterns altered convoy schedules. More tanks moved up in spring, fewer in winter when missions stayed shorter but higher. Spare prop blades for counter-rotating sets became a new staple. Even the smell changed on some flight lines, less of burned glycol from overheated engines, more of heated oil from high-hours turbos that had finally learned to live with desert dust and European damp both. These are not romantic details. They are the texture of a machine finding its groove in a continent-spanning supply chain. The people inside the numbers change, too. Germans who'd called the Lightning a lumbering curiosity in 1942 used different words by 1944. Respect. One wrote in a letter home he never mailed. Respect. Ja, nicht Zerstörer-Jäger. Not a destroyer, but a fighter. Americans who'd cursed freezing feet over Germany loosened their grip when cockpit heaters on late models finally did what the label promised. "I could feel my toes on climb out," a pilot joked, then stopped joking because it mattered. A mind unfrozen is a mind that notices the contrail at 2 o'clock a beat earlier. That beat saves lives. If you look for heroes here, you can find them names with tallies chalked on boards, crews who turned wrenches under sleet and sun, men who flew home on one engine and a prayer. But the story resolves at another level. The forked tail forced the Luftwaffe to play by someone else's tempo. The shock of a new silhouette faded. The clock it carried did not. That is how concepts prove themselves, by dragging an opponent into a schedule that bleeds him even on days he believes he won. Even as P-51 seconds took over more of the deepest escort work, and jugs dove on roofs until tiles flew, the Lightning's fusion of range, steadiness, and straight-shooting nose had already moved the war into a place the early Luftwaffe did not imagine. Memory settled where it always does in war, in routines performed until they felt inevitable. In Italy, by autumn, it was ordinary to see a pair of P-38 seconds ghosting along a ridgeline at dawn, then hear a railway yard cough smoke by 9, then read a report that afternoon about a bridge span gone and a convoy split. In France, it was expected to see a forked tail appear in the corner of a canopy just as a German pilot rolled in, expected to hear the distant punctuation of a nose battery writing its answer, expected to track the shape south as it went, looking for trains. Habit is the truest legacy. Once unthinkable, then shocking, then routine, that is the curve of a design that matters. Across time, the consequences cracked out, like ice splitting on a river. Post-war air forces studied the lesson that shape is permission. Split mass in the right places, gather effect where it counts, and you can defy categories without lying to physics. Not every twin could be agile. Not every mixed role fighter could be honest. But the Lightning had shown that coherence, the internal agreement between range, stability, and weapon layout, beat aesthetics. Not an angel's silhouette, but a negotiator's contract with the air. That insight flowed forward into aircraft that did not look like P-38 seconds at all, but carried its logic. Put the weight where it serves the mission. Let the mission write the map. Let the map write the clock. Pilots carried softer inheritances in their bones. Against a twin boom, they'd learned to question assumptions quickly, to look twice at a silhouette and not trust the label their instructors had stamped a year earlier. That instinct, once learned, saves lives long after one model retires. It says, categories lie. It says, the enemy gets a vote, and sometimes his vote is an entirely new shape. And yet the P-38 was not a myth. It had bad days, bad batches, bad weather. It could be beaten, and was. The Luftwaffe, even in retreat, could still carve a day bloody with a good plan and brave men. None of that erases what the Lightning did to the geometry and the schedule of a vast war. The twin boom did not end the Luftwaffe. It helped end its freedom to choose when and where to fight on terms it liked. On a gray morning near Metz, a German crew chief traced his finger along the dented leading edge of a 109 just brought home by a pilot who would not climb out of the cockpit for a long minute. "Gabelschwanz?" he asked quietly. The pilot nodded once, eyes fixed on a point somewhere the finger could not touch. You could read a whole campaign in that nod. Surprise, learned, respect, earned, time lost. Return to the sky above Bizerte, June 9th, 1943. Feldwebel Otto Riedel, the copper sun, the forked tail slicing down. We left him inverted, Tunisia upside down in his canopy. Imagine him leveling, panting, alive, because luck and a good airframe agreed for a few seconds. He writes Gabelschwanz on a form because that's what he knows to say. Months later, after briefings warn against head-ons, after escorts arrive early and stay late, after convoys learn to fear the road, he would write something else if the form allowed. Not forked tail. Schedule breaker. The change is not poetic. It is practical. It is the difference between seeing a shape and understanding what the shape does to your day. Not through glamour, but through geometry. Not through aces tallies, but through altered timetables. Not through myth, but through a machine that kept showing up where the plan said it shouldn't. The camera pulls back one last time. Contrails scribble hard lines over a continent with too many names for dawn and too many graves for memory. 2 silver streaks cross the frame. Their twin shadows stitched to the ground by a light that sharpens everything and forgives nothing. The lesson hangs there after they pass, quiet and exact. In modern war, the machine that changes time wins.